Hi everybody, we're back for another episode of Infernal Intercourse between me and Pastor Brian. And this time we're going to talk about consent and sex in Lucifer, because our main character has a lot of sex and a lot of sexual partners. But he also seems kind of concerned that there is consent involved. So that might not traditionally be what people thought Satan would do. So I'll throw it up for some opening remarks from Pastor Brian.
Well, it's just funny. I was thinking as you were saying that, boy, is it typical for someone with daddy issues and mommy issues, right? To use sex as their escape. You know, we did talk about the addiction issue, but definitely Lucifer seems to celebrate sex, which, you know, I come from a Christian tradition that is sex positive and celebrates sex. But we also know sex can be a way of running away from things, a way of avoiding things. But in this episode about consent, I feel pretty confident, I think you agree, that Lucifer is pretty right on with what we agree about what is consent in the current era.
Okay, yeah, so we have a couple of examples. In the first season, there's a time when Chloe gets drunk, and she comes to his place and she says, "I wish I were more like you. You just take whatever you want." And he says, "Since the beginning of time." And then she really throws herself at him and he doesn't do anything about it. So this "you take whatever you want and I have since the beginning of time" doesn't seem to be true, because he wants her, but he apparently doesn't want her drugged and drunk. He wants to know that she's chosen him without being muddled by alcohol. So they don't have sex.
Or has he evolved? We really don't get much evidence that he was ever different, but I mean, I guess that's a possibility in there.
Well, we do when he talks to Eve in season 4, she says he was the only person who ever asked her what she wanted.
Yeah, that's true.
So even back in Eden times, he was still concerned that if he was going to sleep with Eve, I guess, that she wanted him and that was her choice, when she didn't have a choice with Adam.
Yeah, that's true. With Eve, we get a good history of him, right? And we can see all the way back that, yeah, he's consistent in this thing. Yeah.
And we also see in the episode where two of his lovers die, and they want to know everybody else he's slept with for the past 8 weeks. He comes up with like 90-something names, but he knows all their names. He seems to know their wants, their desires, their proclivities, the things they like to do. He obviously has kept their contact information because the police are able to get hold of them fairly easily. So it's not like he's having lots of sex with people he's just using and then throwing out, right? So they're people to him. He's having sex with people and not just, I want to have sex, so whoever's closest, let's just do this, right? So there is a level of respect and consent that he's looking for from everybody, basically.
Right, and I was thinking about that with the other characters, and you know, we discussed a little bit, but it seems like all of the main characters follow the rules for consent, which is interesting because our society is so terrible about that. So I do find that fascinating, and you know, I really could picture a hell where he really took advantage of people, but even Maze doesn't seem to be a person who violates consent sexually. Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Lucifer and Maze have had lots of sex over the eons. He alludes to that in the first season. But to me, it's interesting that the sex part is consensual, apparently.
Yeah.
She was into it. But until season 3, maybe, or maybe late season 2, he really doesn't see Maze as a person. You know, in the first season, he's really good at using Maze as a thing. You're my bodyguard. I brought you here to protect me. You'll do your job, basically. But he has to move beyond that. Eventually, at some point, you know, he and she are both in a session with Linda, and he's like, "Well, she's never felt like that before. She's never been offended when I just basically treated her like a rag." And Linda's like, "Well, and then he looks over and Mace is crying. So he realizes that, he's treated her poorly for a very, very long time, but not with sex, apparently."
Right.
So he has looked at demons the way apparently he was supposed to, that he is an angel, he's been sent down, they're more or less his slaves that have to do what he wants in hell, and he just sort of accepted that and has
They have no soul, right? They
no
have no.
soul. They have no choice. They just have to do what he wants. So in that sense, demons don't have the ability to consent to his rule or his laws or anything. They just have to do what he says because he's an angel, and that's the way the system's set up. But once he and Maze are on Earth, and then they start to have to negotiate this, I'm no longer really your boss, you don't have to obey me anymore. And she has to get this, oh, I don't have to obey you anymore, I can be my own person. And they work that out, somewhat over the 4 seasons that we've seen so far.
Well, it's interesting, it got a little complicated, more from a life and death point of view than about sex, but when you're dealing with the demons and things like that, at the end of season 4, when he has to command power as king of hell again, or whatever, as ruler of hell, it still is interesting, right? Like which demons followed him, which demons immediately fell back into that, and which demons challenged it. And I realize it's not about sex, but to a certain degree there is an interesting point about consent there. The demons do pose a unique problem with that.
And they do have a point. I mean, apparently hell has been set up as a system where an angel has to run it, in the show anyway, and they have to do what the angel says, and Lucifer's been gone. So there's been no one who's been given out the orders, right? There's been no one to follow, and they have been without this leader that they are required to have by God. So the fact that they want him to come back, and then when he says no, they're going to try to take the baby back, you kind of, at the same time, are thinking, well, these guys are awful. How many options have they got, basically,
Well, but also that's a non-consent, right? They're taking the baby without the parents' consent. They're going to try and control that baby. Then, it was very clear that it wasn't, they were now going to allow that Nephilim baby to be the leader, but that they were going to use the baby to impose their will.
In hell, yeah. So we do see consent, but I think you mentioned that our characters operate a lot higher level than a lot of people in the real world in terms of consent. It's interesting to see on other areas the things the show ignores. I mean, the show has pretty much completely ignored any social repercussions of, say, interracial relationships or women in positions of power. In the first season, the police lieutenant we only saw her a couple times was a woman. No one had anything to say about that. So in some ways, this is a really idealistic Los Angeles, right? Because no one seems to really care too much, except for the one episode we see in the 4th season about racism. People don't seem to care too much about gender equality. People just seem to have it. And consent for sex seems to be sort of a central tenet of most of our characters, the way they can structure their sexual lives. So, I mean, that's cool.
Including bisexuality and homosexuality, again, not much a big deal made about that, even
right.
when he's very open about it. And the other people who may not expect it don't seem to be shocked by it, so there's definitely a little utopianism going on there.
Right, so when his male lover is killed, at first he thinks Chloe's surprised that he has male lovers, and she's like, no, I don't, whatever. I'm just now telling you that both people we found murdered this morning were lovers of yours. You're the common theme going on here, and that's when they need to know the names of all of his lovers. So the fact that his lover was male doesn't seem to, bother Chloe a bit. She just needs to know who else might be in danger.
And in true Lucifer, he makes it all about him, but that's a whole other episode.
Right. So the one area where we see him abrogating, I guess, that may not be the right word, but not getting consent is that he is able to make people tell the truth, right? So if you want to sit there and say that you didn't commit the crime or whatever, and he can basically sort of force you to come up with the truth, which sometimes helps a lot, and sometimes it's just played for laughs. I mean, one of my favorites is when they get the airline pilot, he's like, what is it you really want? And he's like, I want to start a cat sanctuary. And you're like, okay. But people don't have a choice when he does that.
That's completely non-consensual, absolutely. Yeah.
And is that part of this whole, he has this relationship with the truth that that Satan, supposedly the prince of lies, you think would not have.
Well, and it is interesting because I catch myself in many episodes where he's telling partial truths or half truths, right? He says he always tells the truth, but that wouldn't pass the muster with most people's definition of truth sometimes. And so that does, I think, come into play when we're talking about consent. But still, he doesn't, when it comes to consent for sex at least, he seems to always be very upfront and honest. And I just like the idea that, he never sleeps with anybody without telling you he's Lucifer. Now, you may not believe that he's Lucifer, but he honestly tells you he's Lucifer. And he doesn't try it and play it coy, like, oh, you're not going to believe me, but I am. I mean, he's really trying to tell you he's Lucifer, and it's only you who's choosing not to hear that. I don't know if my AA sponsor would consider that full truth or not. My AA sponsor would hold me responsible for making sure the other person really understood it before I engage in sexual activity with them. But I think in our society it goes.
I think he wants to believe that he always tells the truth, but he's, especially with his self-destructive behavior, he's still in a lot of denial, right? So it's that kind of untruth where, I don't have a problem kind of untruth, right? So it feels true to him maybe, or he wants it to be true, even if it's not. So is that the truth? But yeah, he certainly does come out and say, I'm the devil, and those kind of things he just blurts out.
Which is really fascinating, since we talk sometimes about Eastern versus Western theology with this show, because, there is an Eastern school that would say the way it should be is the way I'm describing it. Right? The way I would like it to be, or the way that it really should be is how I'm describing it, without really worrying about if that's exactly the way it is right now. So that's kind of an interesting thought too.
Okay, any other thoughts on sex and consent in Lucifer?
Yeah, I think they're pretty progressive in this, and just about sex in general with this, it's pretty hard to find that nowadays. And it is surprising to me, actually, that they don't get more pushback on the sex here. I do think it's a little naive in this day and age to avoid talking about race. I think that comes into it both sexually and other ways. But I think pretty much when it comes to ongoing explicit consent, which it's so hard to make people in our society to follow, I think this show does a good job of normalizing that and showing that it can be sexy and that it's the right way to go.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for watching another episode of Infernal Intercourse. Press the like and subscribe buttons and hit that bell notification. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.